Vladimir Putin's energy war has been defeated. He couldn't break Ukraine's infrastructure and freeze them and freeze the rest of us. His food war has been defeated. He couldn't blockade Ukraine's ports, and Ukraine has actually driven the Russian Black Sea Fleet out of the western part of that waterway. The question is, in 2024, is beyond the battlefield, will Putin's information war succeed? I mean, John, you know so much of this is perception rather than reality. So how much of Russian propaganda, which is being recycled wittingly or unwittingly by far too many people, that Ukraine will eventually fall, that Western support will eventually fade and will collapse, how much will that in fact lead to, for example, in the United States, hard-right Republicans and Trumpists succeeding in taking the U.S. out of the scene? And how much will it undermine folks within Europe and in other areas like Asia? I think that's the open question in 2024, is a type of hybrid warfare where what is said in terms of misinformation and disinformation may have more effect than any single fighter jet or any single piece of artillery.
Now, Israel's been bombarding Gaza, a relentless bombing campaign. It is said to have killed over 20,000 Palestinians. At the same time, Russia's invasion of Ukraine goes on, with little progress being made in terms of territory by either invader or defender. I spoke to Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the University of Dublin, and also to Simon Diggins, a former officer in the British Army who served in the Middle East and who's now a defence and security analyst.
I think there's been a wider issue within Europe of recognising that relying on the Americans to do all the dirty work and all the heavy lifting is not really going to work any longer. We've known for a number of years that the Americans have been what Obama called the tilt towards the Pacific. But the fact of the fighting in Ukraine and the war in Ukraine has now started to re-energize NATO, re-energize countries to think about their defense. And I think that will continue. And I think we'll go from there. I think curious and analogous things also happened in the Middle East, where we've also got people now thinking again about what might, and people talk about the day after, being the day after the current conflict, but what might the solutions be, if they indeed exist, for the challenge of Israel and Palestine? Because one of the striking things that came out from that is the sense that, in a sense, this has been frozen since 2005, when the Israelis pulled out of Gaza. And that was supposed to be a precursor to a serious attempt to try and create the two-state solution as agreed by the various accords. And the sense has been, and there'll be people who say, well, no, this hasn't happened, and people have been talking, that really no significant progress has taken place, whether it's good faith or bad faith on people's hands. So I think in two ways, these two conflicts have encapsulated these sort of broader challenges that are going to exist and continue to exist through 2024, and it's going to really tax the chancellors, I think, particularly of Europe, who I think have rather tended to assume it's somebody else's problem or somebody else can pick up the bill for it. And actually, both conflicts are going to require us to engage really rather thoroughly.
Yeah, that is also very interesting. I mean, I'm not sure I'd describe it necessarily as positives. You could see it that way, where I suppose when it comes to Russia, we're now looking at a strengthened awareness of the need for Western security against a threat from Moscow. You can call that, I suppose, a positive. There's probably a better word somewhere. And when it comes to Gaza, there is more focus on the ultimate, end of a two-state solution. However, on earth we get there. Let me just focus now first with both of you on Ukraine in particular. Scott, look at the plight of Ukraine at the start of 2024, engaged in a painfully difficult struggle against Russia on one hand, and on the other, you could term it a struggle against the possibility of growing war weariness, even apathy, among Ukraine's friends and allies in the international community.
John, you look at 2024, and I think the starting point is to sort of remember that this has never been a sprint. At best, it's a 1,500-meter race, and it's perhaps even a marathon. And to follow on Simon's excellent points, you already have seen coming out of the destruction, the war crimes of the Russians, a very different Europe in terms of the support of Ukraine. Again, leaving aside Mr. Putin's ally, Viktor Orban in Hungary, that the rest of the EU, getting us to the point where we're talking about a path for Ukraine's accession to the bloc, something that would have been unthinkable a couple of years ago. And where you're looking at a NATO which includes its 31st member, Finland, and I think in the near future, its 32nd member, Sweden. That question of recognizing the stake of what is involved here, and in effect saying, look, the rules of the game are important, does bring us to the imminent thing of, well, okay, what does that mean in terms of the battlefield, the immediate battlefield? And I think you come down to the fact that even though Ukraine's counteroffensive from last June only made gradual gains in the east and in the south, it wasn't the climactic breakthrough that I think some folks built it up too much to be. That you're talking about a Ukraine which still is pretty much holding its lines. Russia has only taken one city since July 2022. That's Bakhmut, and one other town recently. That's all they've been able to gain, despite human waves attack, in which the Russians have lost now, according to Western services, not the Ukrainians, more than 300,000 personnel, 87% of their active duty force in 2022.
Yes.
When you note that Ukraine is holding those lines, and when you add to the fact that Vladimir Putin's energy war has been defeated, he couldn't break Ukraine's infrastructure and freeze them and freeze the rest of us. His food war has been defeated. He couldn't blockade Ukraine's ports, and Ukraine has actually driven the Russian Black Sea Fleet out of the western part of that waterway. The question is, in 2024, is beyond the battlefield, will Putin's information war succeed? I mean, John, so much of this is perception rather than reality. So how much of Russian propaganda, which is being recycled wittingly or unwittingly by far too many people, that Ukraine will eventually fall, that Western support will eventually fade and will collapse, how much will that in fact lead to, for example, in the United States, hard-right Republicans and Trumpists succeeding in taking the U.S. out of the scene? And how much will it undermine folks within Europe and in other areas like Asia? I think that's the open question in 2024, is a type of hybrid warfare where what is said in terms of misinformation and disinformation may have more effect than any single fighter jet or any single piece of artillery.
Yeah, important point. And Simon, Ukraine is a victim of what was, in many ways, a predictable problem of inflated expectations. And we do remember Zelensky warning at the beginning, and even before the beginning of the counteroffensive, don't expect anything to happen overnight. It's, as you say, a marathon, not a sprint. But yet you see signs of people being weary, I don't know, even bored, although that's an extraordinary word to use in this context, weary with the lack of what they see as of progress. I don't know how you deal with that, because that does seem to be a problem.
Yes, it is. I think we've had a perception of recent wars that they were to use an Americanism, a quick, decisive victory, which actually was at one time their official doctrine, kind of use of massive, overwhelming force, minimum own force casualties, and keep moving and breaking things. And that's been the approach. I mean, the Ukrainians were never in that position. They were always materially, but particularly in terms of manpower, as the kind of the second power compared to Russia. They attempted a counteroffensive without the use of any kind of air superiority. Nobody has tried that since 1917. I mean, literally, that's a kind of historical perspective on that. That was the last time somebody tried to conduct any kind of significant counteroffensive without that. And in very, very few places could they bring together, again, I'll use a Soviet term, but the correlation of forces, that kind of massive, overwhelming firepower and concentration of force to try and achieve a breakthrough across a massive front from 1,500 kilometer front. And so that sort of misconception of we're going to conduct a counteroffensive and people doing lines on maps, and so if they can get through to Mariupol, that will cut them off. That will cut off the Crimea, and really hammer through a blow to Putin, who's put so much emphasis on Russia taking off the Crimea. There was always this gap between what was realistically possible and the kind of the aspirations that were there.
Yeah.
Very rapidly, the Ukrainians found themselves in a position where a significant level of Russian defences were put in place, and we do know, but from history, that both through the Imperial Russian Army, the Soviet Army, now the Russian Army, is actually rather good on the defensive. And it creates a significant debt. So this dislocation of expectation versus reality is something which is unfortunate and unhelpful, and we've now had as Scott said, a result with a kind of at the very least, or very best, a very limited amount of success for their counteroffensive. And so people are talking about, well, is that the end then for them? And it isn't. But I think there was a very marked mistake in assuming that they would achieve a massive breakthrough in a war. That was not going to happen.
And Scott, how worried then should Ukraine be at the beginning of 2024 about the way this war is heading? In America, the continuing flow of funding is in real question, with a lot of problems for President Biden in Congress, especially on the Republican side. And in Europe, similar story, almost a mirror of the story where Hungary is standing in the way of a full flow of supply and funds from the European Union. And yes, look, you make the point, both of you, that Ukraine has done extraordinarily well to hold the line in the way that it has, and in places like Avdiivka, the losses inflicted on Russia have been disproportionate. You could say Russia's paying a heavy price in this fairly static line. But we hear just now a Ukrainian general saying that the Ukrainian forces are running out of ammunition all along the front. How worried, Scott, do you think Ukraine should be?
Well, John, when you're fighting for your existence, you're always concerned. And that even when Ukraine was regaining territory and liberating areas in the south and the east was the case. What you have got is the imminent question, which is on the ground, will you continue to have the necessary supplies to hold back the Russians? And we've always known that the main Russian advantage was simply the sheer human force, the numbers of people they would throw into the front line, backed up by artillery. I think the European dimension of this will get assurances. Despite Mr. Orban's blockade of the 50 billion euro fund to provide not only for military assistance, but financial and economic assistance, you're seeing individual European countries, indeed in recent days, not only restating, but amplifying their support across all fronts for Ukraine in terms of equipment, which has come, for example, from Denmark and Sweden, commitment to financial and economic assistance, which has come from European countries and from the World Bank itself. And I do think that there will be a compromise reached with Mr. Orban, who, to be honest with you, is blackmailing the European Union to get the release of support funds for Budapest. More than 30 billion euros in support funds that have been held up because of his government's rights and rule of law violations. That messy compromise will be made, I think, in early 2024. What I cannot give you an assurance of, and I don't think what the Ukrainians see an assurance of, and this goes back to Simon's initial point, is that the Americans will be there if Donald Trump returns to the White House. We are already in the extraordinary situation where a handful of hard-right Republicans and Trumpists paralyzed Congress since October in terms of $60 billion of ongoing budgetary support for Ukraine, a blackmail which was reinforced by more moderate Republicans who have said, look, unless you give us draconian border measures, we won't help Ukraine. That's a tougher nut to crack if you've got someone like Trump who has the prospect of victory. I do think Europe can continue to give Ukraine necessary support to function as a government, to function as an economy. I do think others, of course, will step up. Don't forget places like Australia, like Japan, like Canada. But I do think the question of Ukrainian military effectiveness will be jeopardized if U.S. takes itself off the board, or to be more specific, if an unpredictable man named Donald Trump, who, remember, was impeached for blackmailing Ukraine in 2019, if he takes the Americans off.
All right, let's move on to Gaza. Scott, At the United Nations and in capitals around the world, we're seeing pressure building up on Israel to moderate its the form of its attack in Gaza. That surely will yield results. That will lead to changes, Scott, won't it, or will it?
I am not as confident as you, John, that the international community has leverage on the Israeli war cabinet if it decides to persist in what has become a mass killing, not only of Hamas fighters, a war, if you will, but a mass killing of Gaza civilians and a displacement of almost 2 million of them, 80% of the population. I say that because when we had the initial phase one of this conflict, the international community, including the UK, including the US, including most European countries, including some Asian countries, including Middle Eastern countries, all pressed the Israelis, often behind closed doors. Don't go in with a ground offensive. Don't go in with the all-out bombing. This was not because they were whitewashing Hamas's attack. Those members of the international community told the Israelis, we recognize that with its mass killing of Israeli civilians and foreign nationals on October 7th, with the seizing of hundreds of hostages, Hamas had crossed a line that it had to be taken out of power. But the question was how you do it. And, political, economic, security measures. The Israeli war cabinet not only pushed aside that advice and went ahead with the ground offensive after the week-long humanitarian pause, where some hostages were released for women and children held in Israeli prisons. The Israeli war cabinet redoubled that effort throughout December, stepping up the bombing and the ground assault throughout all of Gaza. I think there is only one country in the international community that could put a check on that, and that's the United States. And the United States had two levers, which it chose not to use. To this point, it has not used its lever in the UN Security Council of support of a ceasefire. Indeed, it has vetoed the resolution for a ceasefire, the only country to stand against it in the latest vote. And the U.S. significantly has not restricted military assistance to Israel since October 7th. To the contrary, the U.S. has provided more than 50,000 shells and more than 15,000 bombs, more than 10,000 of which are unguided weapons. In other words, it's American weapons that are involved in the Israeli campaign in Gaza right now, even as the death toll approaches 20,000 people. Now, there are negotiations which will continue through December to try to get a ceasefire resolution, or at least a resolution for suspension of hostilities. But I think the biggest challenge to the Israeli war cabinet, in particular Prime Minister Netanyahu, who, I'll be blunt with you, sees this war as a way to stay out of prison, something that goes back to bribery allegations against him. The only check on the Israeli war cabinet is if domestic opinion in Israel, which has been inflamed by the issue of the hostages, not just the number of hostages Hamas continues to hold, more than 130, but the 3 Israeli hostages who were killed by the Israeli military in recent days. I think that sentiment amongst Israeli public that enough is enough, that would be the only thing to check the Israeli war cabinet. And at this point, while it might lead to another brief humanitarian pause, I don't see it stopping the prosecution of the war, albeit a war which, in the words of one member of that war cabinet, Benny Gantz, has no endgame.
Simon, that is a grim analysis from Scott. I mean, the idea that Benjamin Netanyahu is using the war as an opportunity to hang on to power is a dark thought. He's not alone in that. You now hear that from experts in and out of Israel. Do you share that view? And what does it mean for the end of this? What is the object? We heard the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak say what needs to happen is that Hamas needs to be taken away from power, and it needs to lose its ability to attack Israel using tunnels and so on. But how to do that? I mean, you can't eradicate Hamas by killing all its fighters, or for that matter, maybe killing all its leaders, assuming that's possible. And how does Israel get to where it wants to be, wherever that is?
And I think that's the challenge. I think the other dark thought is not just about the personal survival of Benjamin Netanyahu, but whether or not And I used an analogy going back to 9/11, whether when after 9/11, those people who surrounded George Bush, the people of so-called the project for the new American century, decided, in the words of Donald Rumsfeld, to wrap up Iraq, wrap the whole thing up at once. I mean, a dark theory would be, and it's heard from some of the Israeli ministers who surround Netanyahu, that this was the equivalent of that Pearl Harbor moment. 9/11 was a Pearl Harbor moment. It allowed the neocons to do what they wanted to do. That this awful, ghastly attack on October 7th has, if you like, unleashed the dark force that's existed within Israeli politics to sort out, not just sort out Hamas, but to sort out Gaza and everything that goes with it. And we've heard people on the Israeli government, talking about a second Nabka. We've heard them talking about resettling Gazans, in Europe and elsewhere. That they should be moved around the Middle East. That suggests they're not saying not interested in a two-state solution. They're not interested in any solution that effectively has any kind of functioning, working Palestinian government in Gaza itself. Now, that is only one option, and it's probably another dark option which people would hope is not going to occur. But I think it exists as a possibility, and it goes back to Scott's point that a ceasefire, in a good sense, could be an opportunity for a refresh, a rethink, a re-examination of tactics, perhaps an adoption of the tactics we're suggesting. Exactly, Scott said at the beginning that what should now happen is a series of targeted intelligence-led strikes that don't involve what's actually happened. But there is absolutely no guarantee that's what the Israelis are going to do, because even if America turned off the tap now, in terms of arms, ammunition, and supplies, then the Israelis are well equipped and have got plenty of ammunition to keep themselves going, particularly if they're using dumb bombs, which they are, to achieve what they're going to do. So I think there are a number of options out there, but the one I think that people kind of rather naively hope for, that this ceasefire will then turn into something more permanent and a kind of rational, reasonable solution that then leads to conversations about the two-state solution. I don't think they're in any way guaranteed. I think we could be in for a very dark and difficult time.
Scott, your thoughts? So, do you consider just talk of a two-state solution emerging sometime in the imaginable future? Is that just now a fantasy?
I mean, the reality is that we haven't had meaningful approach to a two-state solution with a Palestinian state and an Israeli state each having security since 2009. That was the last set of meaningful negotiations, which were being brokered by the U.S. government. After that point, again, to be very honest with your listeners and not taking sides here, but Prime Minister Netanyahu has not had any interest in a two-state solution with an independent Palestinian state.
I think he's open about that now.
I think, John, I would start off with where we are in 2024 with this, and that is, if you could get a ceasefire, and why a ceasefire is so important, or at least an extended humanitarian pause, is to get aid into the Gaza Strip. I mean, remember, we're not just talking about, almost 20,000 killed, the large majority of whom are civilians. We're talking about almost 2 million of the 2.3 million people are displaced. We're talking about very few functioning hospitals. We're talking about a lack of water supplies. We're talking about shelters which are holding people 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times their capacity. If you could get humanitarian aid in to begin to ease that situation, even a small easing of it, you at least create a new environment where Gaza's civilians begin to see some sense of, all right, there are provisions. There are people who are actually caring for us, and those people may not necessarily be Hamas. If you can then build up off those international aid provisions to provide for a multinational approach in terms of humanitarian workers on the ground, humanitarian agencies on the ground, then you start to build up the structure for Gaza, and then you get the space to consider the thorny question of who could govern this area? It can't be Hamas. It probably couldn't be the Palestinian Authority, which doesn't have support from the large majority of Palestinians for a number of reasons I can talk about, including their misrule in the West Bank. But until you get a ceasefire, we will be talking in terms of the abstract about any type of post-conflict situation in Gaza. I'm simply just saying we have to get all the adults into the room, including Palestinians, and we have to do it in an environment where they're not being bombed and starved on a daily basis. And that's the necessary beginning point before we can go any further in terms of what happens next, including a two-state resolution.
Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the University of Dublin, and Simon Diggins, a former officer in the British Army who served in the Middle East, now working as a defence and security analyst. Defence and security analyst. Defence and security analyst. Defence and